Look, I'm sorry to have to be the one to break this to you, but your steroids take, it's probably wrong. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but before we get to that, here's a question for you. When was baseball's steroid era? Was it in the 90s, when the drugs were all over the place and many of the best players and the best things they did during that time were connected to them? Or was it in the 2000s? Things like the Mitchell Report and Jose Canseco's book, Juiced, made the issue into a national scandal. In any case, baseball's steroid era is still one of the most talked about parts of the game's 150-plus year history. Some of the game's best ever players have ruined their reputations by ever getting involved with them. Out of the 28 players who've hit more than 500 home runs, more than a quarter of them have either tested positive or been directly connected to PEDs. Even if we can't put a precise date on when the steroid era actually was, there are a few inflection points that frame a lot of both how we understand it, who we identify it with, and when we think of it happening. But there's one more question that nobody seems to want to ask, and that's the why of the steroid era. Why were so many players motivated to break the rules so aggressively? And why did they do it all at the same time? And why, if it was such a problem, did basically no one try to stop them? The inflection point we're going to look at is pretty symbolic of this entire time period, and with the benefit of hindsight, it's got to be one of the most important moments in baseball history. After nearly going extinct when the labor dispute ended the 1994 season, baseball had been having a rough time regaining its place in the national sports scene. Its new de facto commissioner, Bud Selig, more on him later, was trying all sorts of stuff to make it more exciting, including adding in things like the wild card round, interleague play, and even a few completely new teams. But the boost Selig wanted wouldn't really come until 1998, when a couple of different players looked like they might have a real shot at breaking baseball's most coveted single-season record. King Griffey Jr. was the reigning American League MVP after putting up some genuinely astounding stats in 1997. And Mark McGwire was also coming off a season where he'd flirted with the all-time home run mark. There would also be a third challenger appearing in this contest a little later on, but even before Sammy Sosa got into the mix, there was an excitement building around that season that can really only be brought out by a home run chase. 4 separate players, McGwire, Sosa, Griffey, and Greg Vaughn, all hit 50-plus home runs, something that's only happened one other time in the history of baseball. And just kind of keep that in the back of your head, because the other year is pretty important too. All of this was in service of breaking Roger Maris's all-time home run record of 61 in a 162-game season, which he set back in 1961. But by the middle of that summer, it was pretty evident that Maris's record was gonna fall, to the point that it wasn't really a question of if someone was gonna hit 62, but who, and how fast. As the season wore on, McGwire and Sosa emerged as the two who would really chase Maris. Griffey fell off the pace and only wound up hitting 56. Frickin' scrub. The two men went back and forth for weeks, but in the end, it was McGwire who ended up winning the race to 62, this rare wall scraper in his home ballpark in St. Louis. And what a moment that was. McGwire's family was there, Roger Maris's family was there, heck, even Sammy Sosa was there to see Big Mac break the home run record that had stood for nearly 40 years. But as exciting as it was at the time, history has not remembered this moment nearly as fondly, mostly because of what's happened since. In 2010, Mark McGwire admitted to using steroids in the same season that he broke the home run record 12 years later. That is sad all on its own, but what's even sadder is that it was not even remotely a surprise. McGwire was one of the players, along with Sammy Sosa, called to the congressional hearings in 2005 over steroid use in baseball, where he famously said this.
I'm not here to talk about the past.
Yeah. Hey, Mark? Can I call you Mark? Look, I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life or anything, but talking about the past is literally the only reason you're here. As much as he may not have wanted to discuss it in front of Congress, McGwire's past was far from unique in baseball at the time. But why was that a thing? On the surface, the answer seems pretty straightforward. Performance-enhancing drugs, shockingly, help enhance performance, and their increased availability, combined with the fact that MLB didn't even technically make them illegal until the early 90s, meant that in many cases, the reward appeared to greatly outweigh the risk. If it could take you from being a career average hitter to being a multi-time All-Star and MVP winner, there was very little chance you would get caught. Why wouldn't you take them? But as much sense as that does make, I still don't think that explains the degree to which these guys were willing to collectively break the rules.
Steroids was when the gyms that you work out, back then, back in the day, that was it. It was readily available. Guys at gyms talked about it. As far as using it on a consistent basis, was the winner of the 93 and the 94.
Now, for a lot of people, the fact that Mark McGwire is admitting to taking steroids is enough. But I think it's worth taking a look at the timing here. According to him, which I know should probably be taken with a grain of salt, but we're going to assume for the moment that he's telling the truth, Mark McGwire started consistently taking PEDs in the winter of 1993. But why then? What was going on in his career that would have motivated him to start doing steroids at age 29? Well, after leading the American League in slugging and OPS Plus in 1992, McGwire missed nearly the entire 1993 season because of a foot injury. And after basically being a league average hitter in 1991, McGwire, already a six-time All-Star and a contender for all kinds of home run records, looked set to lose 2 or more years of his prime if he couldn't get back going more consistently. It was an incredibly frustrating time in his career, so much so that he nearly left the game completely.
I was so frustrated with injuries. I wanted to retire. And at that time I was using steroids thinking it was going to help me. It was brought to my attention that it was going to help me heal faster, make my body feel back to normal. I mean, I was a walking mash unit. It doesn't feel good when we have teammates and people walking by saying, he's injured again.
I don't mention all this to try and excuse Mark McGwire or any of the other players who made the same decision. He took steroids, and steroids are cheating. I just want to highlight that Mark McGwire's injury history was a problem, and for his career to continue in any meaningful way, he needed a solution to that problem.
I did injectables. I preferred the orals. The steroids that I did were on a very, very low dosage. I didn't want to take a lot of that. I took very, very low dosages just because I wanted my body to feel normal.
Now, there are a lot of steps between I would like to feel normal and I would like to take PEDs to feel normal, and we'll get to that in a minute. But to understand Mark McGwire's sense of urgency about getting healthy, you need look no further than what happened to another Cardinals first baseman. Albert Pujols is currently defying Father Time in his pursuit of 700 career home runs, but he would have gotten there a lot sooner if his body hadn't basically just fallen apart on him. Between his rookie year in 2001 and his first year with the Angels in 2012, Albert Pujols averaged 40 home runs, 120 RBIs, a .414 on-base percentage, and most impressively of all to me, an OPS plus of 167. For those of you not familiar with how that stat works, that means he was 67% better than the league average hitter. He was a monster, and a reliable monster at that, missing an average of just 7 games per season in that same span. But then the man nicknamed the Machine started malfunctioning. At age 33, so a few years older than McGwire, but still firmly in an age range where you'd expect him to be really productive, especially in a league where he could DH, Pujols tore his plantar fascia and missed a huge chunk of the 2013 season. And when he did come back, he was not the same player, and really hasn't been since. In stark contrast to those gaudy first-ballot Hall of Fame numbers I read you earlier, post-injury Pujols has basically been a league average hitter. His home run and RBI numbers, while still somehow decent over a 162-game average, have plummeted as his body has continued to pick up more and more injuries, which has, quite sadly, put him out of contention for the all-time home run crown. But Mark McGwire did not want to have his career permanently derailed by injuries. Instead of choosing any of the many potential alternate routes to getting himself healthy again, McGwire went for the nuclear option. Even if there was no formal testing procedure in baseball at that point, and it was so ubiquitous that half the locker room may have been juicing up with him, he was still knowingly breaking the rules. But in the minds of those athletes, it didn't seem as risky as it probably should have, and certainly didn't seem risky enough to get them to stop. There's a phenomenon in social psychology known as risky shift, which I'm pretty sure we talked about in the Astros video, where the diffusion of responsibility within a group setting makes it so the collective makes riskier decisions than the individuals making it up would on their own. To say it another way, when it's our own reputation on the line and the personal stakes are higher, we tend to be more conservative, but when we have others there to take on some of the blame should things go wrong, we tend to be significantly less cautious. This, to me, is the core ideology at the heart of the steroid era, at least for the athletes themselves. In addition to the obvious appeal of getting bigger and stronger, there's an element there of, well, they can't catch all of us, can they? That made the likelihood of people turning to steroids go up significantly. And for a while, they were right. Steroids helped grow the game in the 90s by basically filling baseball with demigods who could hit home runs further and more frequently than anyone thought possible. But just like other examples of risky shifts in decision-making, such as the Houston Astros sign-stealing scandal, if the bottom does drop out of whatever it is you're trying to do, then there will be terrible consequences. I mentioned earlier that 1998 was just one of 2 times in MLB history that 4 separate players have hit 50 home runs in the same season. Well, the other one was in 2001, when someone had the audacity to go after McGwire's record just 3 years after he'd set it. Barry Bonds hit 73 that season to capture the record, but Luis Gonzalez, Alex Rodriguez, and Sammy Sosa all hit 50-plus as well. Now, aside from clearly being able to swat lots of dingers, what do those 4 guys have in common? Yeah, doesn't give you a ton of faith in the system, now does it? Baseball certainly didn't think so, as just 2 years later, they finally started testing for steroids, but the lid didn't really come all the way off till a certain someone wrote a certain book with a certain title that really made the whole thing unavoidable. I don't want to give Jose Canseco too much airtime here, but his 2005 money grab, tell-all autobiography Juiced, was actually a lot more influential on real policies than he probably ever expected. The sheer amount of names and detail that Canseco went into in the book, however much of it was actually accurate, was enough to help shock the baseball world into actually doing something about steroids. Most of it, anyway. There was one guy who seemed really, really determined to pretend like nothing was wrong. There's a psychological principle pretty similar to risky shift called groupthink, where in order to not upset the balance of the collective, a group of people can come to a consensus that runs directly contrary to the evidence in front of them. Steroids were unique in that, at first, they helped baseball respond to an existential threat. But later on, steroids became an existential threat themselves. And in both cases, Bud Selig and the rest of the baseball hierarchy talked themselves into believing things that did not reflect what was actually going on. One of the big questions that's come out of this time is when Bud Selig, who was commissioner of MLB until 2015, knew how big of a deal steroids actually were. He's gone on the record and said that, in his opinion, he did everything he could to try and prevent them from becoming a problem, including unilaterally imposing large-scale testing in the minor leagues by 2000. But by that point, Jose Canseco had already played nearly his entire career, and Mark McGwire had been the home run king for 2 full seasons. By 2000, the train had already left the station, gotten to wherever it was going, and was on its way back. And not even considering the fact that Selig's actions were definitely too little too late, there's evidence that despite what he said since, he was fully aware of the extent of the steroid problem way, way before the new millennium. In the late 80s, FBI agent Greg Stachel was looking into the growth of steroids in Michigan when his operation suddenly got scaled way up. Why did that happen? Because someone very important wanted to know more about how widespread the PED problem was.
The White House had made an inquiry of the Bureau and DEA and wanted to know what we were doing about steroids. That was George H.W. Bush was in the White House at that time. And the only active steroid case in the entire United States was ours. So they told me to put together a Group 1 proposal, and I did, and, the rest, I guess, is history.
That Group 1 proposal turned into Operation Equine, an undercover campaign by the FBI that was trying to bust individual steroid suppliers. The operation ended in more than 70 trafficking convictions, including one of a guy who became of particular interest to baseball people.
The guy that was the Major League Baseball connection was a guy by the name of Kurt Wensloff, who had ties to Michigan but was living in Oakland, California. And Wensloff had become acquainted with Canseco and then subsequently with McGwire. And he was supplying Canseco and McGwire with their steroids when they were both playing for the Oakland A's.
And as the story goes, when Stachel and MLB's chief security officer were at the same conference, Stachel told him about Equine, and not just the information that was publicly available, but the whole story of exactly how bad steroids had gotten in baseball. Now, if I'm Bud Selig, and it's August 1994, well, actually, I may have more immediate problems on my hands, but once I get all that figured out, if my head of security is telling me that the FBI is worried about how much steroids are becoming a problem, I would probably make that a priority. Unless, of course, there was a group incentive to do the exact opposite of that. In the early to mid-90s, baseball was on its knees and didn't have the strength or the energy to do much about steroids for a while. I kind of get that, but to bring this back full circle, by the time the summer of '98 rolled around, they didn't have that excuse anymore. And yet, the response that MLB's chief of security gave Greg Stachel at that conference was still pretty much their stance 4 years later. Major League Baseball knew that steroids were a big threat, but they were benefiting too much to spend the resources and risk the public outcry that would come from doing something about them. This wasn't ignorance. It was groupthink. It was a choice, conscious or otherwise, to not press too hard into steroids until they absolutely had to. Because why would they have? The evidence in front of them, both from on the field and off it, didn't matter. Because the money the sport was bringing in from its juiced-up superstars was making it all seem pretty inconsequential by comparison. Eventually, baseball's steroid reckoning came, and they had to change their tune pretty quickly once Juiced came out and people started getting called to testify in front of Congress. Suddenly, the thing that had saved MLB from extinction initially had become a threat to send them right back there, which presented a bit of a sticky situation for old Bud. He'd spent the last decade riding the steroid gravy train, but now, with the cat out of the bag, he had to be the guy who'd been fighting the good fight that entire time, spending hours at the negotiating table with the union, trying to get them to see some reason. If you can't tell, I'm not a huge fan of Bud Selig's, because you know what really gets on my nerves about all this? This guy is in the Hall of Fame. Despite everything I've just told you, the Veterans Committee determined that Bud Selig was worthy of making it into Cooperstown. But you know who else was on that ballot? Mark McGwire. He got less than a quarter of that vote and is still, as of today, not a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And my hottest take of this entire video, possibly that I've ever made on this channel, is that when the committee meets again this December, that needs to change. Mark McGwire is the greatest power hitter in the history of baseball. You come at me with your Barry Bondses and Hank Aaron's and Harmon Killebrews, and I'll just respond by saying that Mark McGwire has a better home run rate than any of those guys, by like a lot. We talked earlier about how he lost a lot of playing time to injuries, and that's reflected in his stats. But if Mark McGwire had the same number of plate appearances as someone like Ken Griffey Jr., he would have wound up with... oh good lord. You want more? Because I've got more. He's top 10 all-time in OPS among players with more than 5,000 plate appearances. He's second in isolated slugging all-time behind Babe Ruth. And in a post-Moneyball world, I feel compelled to mention that he's 6th all-time in walk rate. But I know what a lot of you will probably say in response to all of this. But he did steroids. And you know what? You're right. He did. He admitted it in front of God and Bob Costas and everyone else. But you know who else did steroids from 1986 to 2001? Basically everyone. If only there was a way we could account for differences in eras and how that might affect the production of the people playing in them. Oh wait, there totally is. That's exactly what statistics like OPS Plus and WRC Plus are for, adjusting for factors like parks and era differences so that if we wanted, we could actually compare someone like Mickey Mantle to Mike Trout. We could also look at how Mark McGwire stacks up in the offense-happy steroid era, which we're totally gonna do, and let me just tell you, he stacks up pretty freaking well. From the year he debuted in 1986 to the time that MLB started testing for steroids in 2003, McGwire is 3rd for OPS Plus behind Barry Bonds and Frank Thomas, and 4th in WRC Plus. Big Mac was an offensive machine if there ever was one, and it's worth mentioning here that a lot of the guys McGwire was hitting all those home runs off of were on steroids too. McGwire had 47 career at-bats against Roger Clemens, 49 against Kevin Brown, who was mentioned in the Mitchell Report, and 20 against Andy Pettitte. It may not seem like much, but those 3 guys alone account for almost 2% of McGwire's career at the plate. The big takeaway here is that your take on the steroid era is probably wrong, because if you're like most of the Hall of Fame votership, you don't think Mark McGwire belongs in there, but also because you're asking the wrong questions. In the aftermath of a big scandal, it's probably important to get answers to things like who was involved, and when, and where, and even how, because those are the kinds of things that people act on. That's what the members of Congress were asking about in 2005, that's what Greg Stachel wanted to know in Operation Equine, and that's how you've probably been thinking about the steroid era since you found out it was a thing. Asking why these things happen is much harder because the answers are a lot less cut and dry. Why did players like Sammy Sosa start taking PEDs? Why did Bud Selig in MLB not do something about steroids earlier? Why is Mark McGwire not in the Hall of Fame? But until you start digging a little bit deeper and start factoring in things like risky shift or groupthink or the unavoidable instinct we all have to protect our own self-interest, then you aren't really going to be able to understand why the steroid era was allowed to happen in the first place. There's no fully right way to wrap your brain around something like this, including the one that I've just spent these past few minutes laying out for you. But most people do it wrong. They ignore the why and focus exclusively on the things that are in front of them, the things they can understand, not realizing that that way of thinking is exactly what led to the thing they hate so much in the first place. Hello to everyone still here at the end of the episode. Thank you so much for watching. Really, it means the world to me that people are paying attention all the way through one of these, so thank you. We're up to well over 2,000 subscribers and adding more every day, which is way better than I thought we'd be doing at this point. And I honestly can't tell you how grateful I am for that. If you enjoyed the content and would like to become one of those subscribers, then welcome. click that button right below the video, make it official. We'd love to have you become a part of the team, whether it's your first time here with us or your 21st. We'll be back with another episode soon, but until then, I'm Will. That's all we have for you today. See you next time.